The couple joined the large crowds climbing the staircase towards the main entrance to the temple. The woman was carrying a child in her arms, a child barely over a month old. In fact, she had carried him all 11 kilometers from Bethlehem the day before, with frequent stops, of course, for nursing and changing the swaddling clothes. The family had then spent the night in a bare room in the city, the only shelter they could afford. As is the common experience for many parents of newborns, they had had little sleep. Nevertheless, they had risen early, thinking perhaps they might beat the crowds, conclude their business quickly, and escape the city before the heat of the day came on. As they passed through the porch and entered into the court of the Gentiles, they realized that they were not the only ones who had had such a thought. The place was packed. It was filled with pilgrims, gawkers, and worshipers. They looked about anxiously. It seemed as if this was going to take a while. The child, fortunately, was not bothered by the noise of the crowd or the cries of the sacrificial animals. He slept contentedly in the arms of his mother, though they shuddered to think what might happen if he did awake. After several inquiries, they made their way to the court of the women. That was where they needed to go. As they approached it, they saw a large pen filled with lambs, and above it, smaller cages with pigeons and turtle doves in them. There were wealthy women there bartering with the sellers, while their nurses held their children at a distance. When the young man heard the prices that were being demanded for the sheep, he winced. He was pretty sure he could have gotten them for a much cheaper price from the shepherds who had dropped by shortly after the child was born. But of course, the sellers here knew that their customers had little other choice. He was glad he didn't have to ask the price of a bird. He knew that would be ridiculous as well. But he had been very fortunate the day before. He'd been able to trap 2 turtle doves as they traveled. The 2 birds cooed in a makeshift cage that he carried in his left hand as he guided the mother and child through the entrance. The last month had been difficult. They had been unable to secure good lodging anywhere. Things had been so unsettled that when the child was born, they had had no choice but to lay him in a simple feeding trough. And things had not gotten much better as they had moved on from there, from place to place, depending mostly on the hospitality of complete strangers. On the 8th day after he was born, they had been fortunate to find a skilled elder who was able to perform the child's circumcision, and he was admitted into the covenant of the people of Israel under the name of Yeshua. It would have been preferable, of course, to return home to Nazareth, where the boy's mother had family connections and support, but they had remained in the area to perform this ritual at the first possible opportunity. There was, after all, some urgency in completing it. Until such time as it was done, the mother would be set apart from all ordinary society. She could not eat with other people. She could not have proper relations with her husband. It was not, of course, because there was anything wrong with her. It was a matter of ritual impurity. Nothing to do with moral sin or error. In many ways, it was more of a special honor than anything else. After all, she had just done something amazing. She had brought new life into the world. Men in particular, were kind of wary of this special power that women had to create life. They didn't quite know what to do with it. And so they felt the need to segregate that kind of power for a certain time out of respect for it. But even if it was a kind of an honor, it was an inconvenient one. The couple were more than ready for it to be over. They waited in line for a time, surrounded by the sound of bleating sheep and cooing pigeons and doves. There were many women waiting to perform the required sacrifice. But eventually the line began to move, and they came to stand in front of a Levitical clerk who sat behind a wooden table. "For what purpose do you come here today?" he asked, in a bored tone, as if it wasn't completely obvious, because of the presence of the month-old child, why they were there. The man was proud to hear his wife respond in a clear and unwavering voice. "I've come for the purification ritual following the birth of my son." And then, in the tones of a bureaucrat who spent all day reciting the same piece of legislation, the clerk responded, "When the days of her purification are completed, whether for a son or for a daughter, she shall bring to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting a lamb in its first year for a burnt offering, and a pigeon or a turtle dove for a purification offering. He shall offer it before Adonai and make atonement on her behalf. Then she shall be clean from her flow of blood. This is the law for her who bears a child, male or female." He looked up at them both, taking in their clothing and their disheveled appearance at a glance. "You're supposed to bring a lamb," he said. "I don't see a lamb. Where's your lamb?" "We have some out on sale in the outer court." The man had been expecting this. And fortunately, he was well versed in the traditions of his people. He knew that the law had been written in such a way as to make allowances for the poor and the disadvantaged. And he had no embarrassment about invoking those traditions. "You know that the law does make provisions for those who cannot afford a lamb," he said. "Maybe you don't care that we have so little, but God cares. And we are allowed to offer 2 turtle doves instead," he said, holding up the cage and the birds. The Levite smirked. "You call those doves? They're filthy. You sure they're not flying rats? You certainly didn't buy them here." "Doesn't matter, does it?" replied the man. "The law never said we had to buy them. I caught these birds myself." "Yes," added his wife with a smile, "I am proud of my man's hunting skills." And so with a sigh, the clerk reluctantly let them pass. People thought that the temple made its money from tithes and donations that the people brought. But the priests and the Levites, they knew where the real money was. It was in the sacrifices. When the sacrifices were performed, some of the meat was returned to the worshipers. Only a certain portion would be burned up, mostly the inedible parts or the parts that were prohibited for Jewish consumption. But the worshipers would take the meat and they would have a feast. The priest wasn't actually paid, not money, but he could claim a portion of the meat for his services, and he often claimed the very best cuts of beef or mutton. In a day's service, a priest could receive so much meat, more than he could possibly eat with his family before it spoiled. And so the meat would be sold off to the elite of the city at premium prices. That was why it was in the interest of those who worked in the temple to pressure the people who were sacrificing fine animals to sacrifice as much as possible. And of course, they had deals with the sellers as well. They got kickbacks for every animal sold to the captive audience. So of course, they would always pressure people to sacrifice the best animal that they could. And this was not something that was only true in the temple in Jerusalem, by the way. This is how it worked in every temple of every god in the Mediterranean world. But not every ritual law had exceptions for the poor. Thanks to the strength of the Judean tradition and the compassion and the care of the God of Israel, the temple could not deny access to the ritual for this impoverished couple. And so it was with some pride for having stood up for their rights, not to mention some relief for having finally completed what was fitting for the birth of the young child of the people of Israel, that the parents walked away from the completion of the sacrifice of their birds. They knew their place within the tradition of their people. It was meaningful for them, and they knew it would be meaningful for their son as well. They felt as if they had begun something very important. They returned to the court of the Gentiles and were surprised when, among all the people present in the swelling crowds, they were approached by a venerable old man and a saintly woman. You know, I always assumed that those first few lines of the story of the infant Jesus in the temple were just a mise en scène, setting up the stage for the important events that were going to take place. I mean, the storyteller just had to get Jesus and his parents into the temple where they could encounter the prophets Simeon and Anna, who would tell us the important things we need to know about Jesus. When I look closely at the opening of the story, I realized that it would be foolish to just skip it over. Because in this part of the passage, the gospel writer is trying to teach us important things about the traditions of the people of Israel and the place of Jesus within them. He is reminding us that Jesus was a part of the covenant of Abraham, that it would have been marked on his flesh on the 8th day after his birth. And he is also reminding us of the rituals of purity. And I think he would have us be mindful that this was not about treating women in Mary's situation as if they were dirty or shameful. It's not what it was about. It was symbolic of the very powerful thing that Mary had just done by bringing life, new life into the world. Especially, of course, in the case of Jesus, where that new life was a gift to the whole world. But what particularly strikes me in this short preface is what it says about poverty. Because Luke has gone out of his way to underline the situation of abject poverty into which Jesus was born up until this point in the story. Laid in a manger because there was no proper place for him. Visited by shepherds, people whose status was about as low as you could go. Luke has already made it quite clear that Jesus was anything but financially well off at his birth. But in this story, a new dimension is added to that impoverished situation. Because, of course, the law was clear. A woman in Mary's situation was expected to bring a lamb for sacrifice. But there was a provision in the law to bring 2 birds instead. It was a concession for people who were in utter destitution, and many would have died before admitting such poverty before the priests. But notice how Luke portrays what Mary and Joseph did. He simply says they offered a sacrifice according to what is stated in the law of the Lord, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. He doesn't even mention that there was an expectation that they should have sacrificed more. He suggests no sense of shame or embarrassment, not on their part, nor on the part of the author. They, according to their means, according to who they were able to do what was pleasing to God. And I find that very refreshing, because we find ourselves living in a world today where more and more people seem to be falling through the economic cracks. And when people can no longer afford housing, or when their wages, even full-time wages, are no longer enough to pay their bills, what happens to them? They're written off. They don't count. They're a problem to be solved, a crisis for various levels of government to fight over. If they resort to living in encampments, they can be evicted without a second thought. If their situation leads to their demise because of addiction or other problems, we react with little more than a shrug. But I'll tell you something, when we callously dismiss an entire class of people, not only do we push them deeper and deeper into crisis, we are robbing society of them, of what they have to offer. And they have to offer so much. I mean, look at what that poor child of Jesus brought. God made room for that impoverished couple to participate in the rituals of the people. They counted, just like any other Israelites before God. And the benefits that came from counting them were incalculable. So what strength couldn't we find for our society if we could only let the poor have a full place and voice in our society? Lord God, let us learn. Let us learn for your care, your concern for the poor, the outsiders, the forgotten. Amen.